There's a quote from Arthur Schlesinger about the speech. He says, President Kennedy began to feel in the spring of 1963 that there was a possibility for some kind of new movement in our relations with the Soviet Union, and he began to look for an opportunity to make a peace speech. And that was the way it was described, and this was a project that was kept extremely confidential in the White House. McGeorge Bundy began in a quiet way to get from 2 or 3 members of the White House staff ideas which might go into such a speech. Ted Sorensen worked on it. The president thought a great deal about it, talked with Sorensen and Bundy, made clear the point of view and the ideas that he wanted. A draft presently emerged. It was shown to a small group in the White House. As I recall, this is Schlesinger, the draft was not shown to the State Department or to the Defense Department until Saturday, and it was before it was given, and it was given on a Monday. You may remember the president went to Hawaii, and I think it was perhaps Friday afternoon the draft was circulated through State and Defense for their comments. Ted Sorensen then flew with the draft to Honolulu. The president worked on the final draft on his way back and gave the speech on Monday morning. So he was addressing the graduating class with the commencement speech in '63. And he talked about universities. He said there are few earthly things more beautiful than a university, wrote John Masefield in his tribute to English universities, and his words are equally true today. He didn't refer to spires or towers, to campus greens and ivied walls. He admired the splendid beauty of the university, he said, because it was, quotes, a place where those who hate ignorance may strive to know, where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. Quotes. I have therefore chosen this time and this place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth is too rarely perceived, yet it is the most important topic on earth, world peace. What kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, forced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I'm talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living. The kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age when great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age when a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by 11 of the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need to use them is the essential to keeping the peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. Some say that it is useless to speak of world peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes, as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace, should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude toward the possibilities of peace, toward the Soviet Union, toward the course of the Cold War, toward freedom and peace here at home. First, let us examine our attitude toward peace itself. Too many of us think it's impossible. Too many think it unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. And man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. I'm not referring to the absolute infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interest of all concerned. There's no simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need be impracticable, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all peoples to see it, to draw from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. And he spoke then about the Soviet Union, but he said no government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity, but we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and in space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, and in acts of courage. And he says that today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries have become the primary targets. It's an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting to weapons massive sums of money that could be better devoted to combating ignorance, poverty, and disease. And we're both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle in which suspicion on one side breeds suspicion on the other, and new weapons beget counter-weapons. In short, the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in halting the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interest of the Soviet Union as well as ours, and even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations which are in their own interest. So let's not be blind to our differences. Let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we're all mortal. And he called then for an end to the arms race and to the nuclear testing and to an arms treaty. And some of these things led then to legislation that started before he died. And now we live in a world where we've gone the other direction, where these treaties are now broken, and the hopes for a peace, even though the Soviet Union, the enemy then, is gone, new enemies have been created, and the stockpiles have grown over those years, and the permanent war economy has grown, and we have a larger military budget now than largest increase under Bush in recent history since Reagan, and it still dominates the possibility, as he says, to spend the money on something else, on human needs, or to meet world needs, and instead the stockpiling and distribution of arms and warfare continue apace. And so these priorities that he tried to establish ended in large part with his death. The Vietnam War policy that he had to withdraw from Vietnam was reversed as soon as he was dead, and took us into that debacle for 10 years and all the cost of it. And continued to grow to the point that our military stockpile has no equal in the world. Even if you go to the next 6 or 7 largest countries and put them together, they still don't come to military compilation of the United States. And now Bush has openly declared a Pax Americana, which he said he didn't want. That was the fight just before September 11th. In August, the Washington Post said that the Pentagon was fighting the Bush administration over this idea that the Bush people said, we're an empire, we better admit it, get about it, establish a Pax Americana, and the people in the Pentagon at that time said, no, we have enough to do. So there was a chance, and people saw the hope in the Kennedys because they responded. Of course, this was itself a response to international movements for nuclear disarmament at that time and for an end to the arms race and attempts at détente. Kennedy was also reaching out behind channels to normalize relations with Castro. But all these things, ending the Vietnam War, normalizing relations, striving for détente, cutting back on the nuclear arms, were in direct opposition to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA and the people around him who had tried to push him into nuclear war at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he and his brother were alone in the room, just about in the opinion that nuclear war was not called for. And they hadn't been happy with his pullback on the Bay of Pigs and his refusal to put in American troops, which they tried to trick him into doing, to overthrow Castro, and his eventual disaffection with the covert operations that Lansdale and the others had handed him when he came into office as a solution. He began to see that the CIA and these agencies were lying to him, and he began to buck all of them and went against their interests. And so as soon as he was dead, those policies were reversed. And Brown and Root, a huge company in Texas run by George Brown, who financed LBJ into political office and into the presidency, made $3 to $4 billion on the construction of Cam Ranh Bay and in Vietnam. And now today, Brown and Root is a subsidiary of Halliburton, which is making even more billions of dollars on the current Gulf War and post-war construction plans. So this military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about when he left office and Kennedy came in, slapped Kennedy in the face and hasn't been diminished since. And Penn Jones, a friend of mine for many years and one of the early Kennedy researchers, used to say in his lectures that we have been in the death grip of the military-industrial complex since November 22nd, 1963. And then he would say, now let's all pray I'm wrong. This turn of Kennedy was no secret. There's been an attempt in the press to say that it was otherwise, but all of the historical evidence that continues to come out, release of National Security Memoranda 263, recent books on Kennedy, Howard Jones's book Death of a Generation, Dalek's new book on Kennedy, further document that he was pulling out of Vietnam. But for many, many years they tried to deny it and bury it, and his aides know it. Pierre Salinger said, I don't know why it's even a debate. He asked me to announce it from the steps of the White House. And other aides have been quoted saying that they knew that he was planning to pull out. And my mother, who was worked at the Pentagon 5 levels above top security and determined the draft calls for the Joint Chiefs, I asked her after she retired, when did they tell you that they would escalate the war in Vietnam? And she told me that in April of 1963, on orders from the White House, which means Kennedy, for the first time in her career of projecting the draft call accurately 5 years in advance, that she was told to reverse her figures. And they were in relation to Vietnam, and that she was to put in figures that reflected a full American withdrawal from Vietnam by the end of 1964 following the election. And that was then reversed on November 25th, 1963, as soon as Kennedy was in the grave. They gave her figures that she at first couldn't believe and took back to the Joint Chiefs to go into a 10-year war with 57,000 American dead on November 25th, 63, right after Kennedy was killed. So the reversal was complete and has been going on since, and not much of anybody in the White House has been able to stop it. Clinton bucked it a little bit and got his messages, and the rest of the people who have been in the White House have pretty much just been in lockstep with it. But it's, I believe, at a crossroads now. I mean, Kennedy, I think, is very prescient in this speech and talks to it at a point when it had more chance of reversal than it does now. But I think now it's so far along the history of humanity is now either going to go down this nightmare path of war and genocide and death that's being pushed by the forces that are in the White House, or people are going to create real democracy and turn the reality of a surplus economy into a world where justice and real peace could be restored and realized. Because we have the potential to do it. We have the resources to do it. There's no need for anybody now to starve or be without housing or transportation or communication or anything else. We have the resources. We have a surplus. The surplus is hoarded into the hands of a few, then it will never be realized as anything except, as Kennedy once said, if you make peaceful revolution impossible, then you make violent revolution inevitable. But even revolution in this time with violence will not substantially, I believe, change the course of this history. It will just give reaction its excuse. And Mussolini defined fascism as corporatism plus reaction. And a situation where the corporations become the state, and the technical capability of death that this juggernaut has puts the Nazi Hohenzollern machine to shame. So unless we make it a democracy and people really decide what way it will go and we use the resources we have for human ends, then I believe we're turning instead on a path toward world genocide. An end to democracy not only here but all over the world. And what's being exported in the name of democracy in these countries has nothing to do with real democracy. It has to do with market penetration and grabs for resources and cheap labor and a facade of choosing the leadership, as we have always done, having learned from the British how to set up empire. But America, in its best dreams, is not about empire. It's about something else, about realizing the possibility that Jefferson and the early founders saw of coming out from under the empire, from the colonial rule, and creating a just and equitable society in which the people themselves have the power. And all generations are limited in their vision of that. These were slaveholders. These were the ruling class, so to speak, of their day, the well-to-do and the landed gentry, and they protected their interests as a group. But at the same time, Jefferson and a few of them, Tom Paine and Sam Adams, had a vision that went beyond that and that would be inclusive over time for all people, and should be. And democracy has its technology now, much more so than in the 17th century, to be fully realized. If that's what we want to do. But we come out every year to commemorate this speech because it's so telling and unfortunately so little known. And it reminds me of the 25 years or so before the Oliver Stone film that I would stand with this many people or fewer out on the grassy knoll on November 22nd and have a moment of silence with Penn Jones and the few people that would come out. It's sad that even the students, of course, they're not here, it's the summer, but they don't, as far as I know, recognize the plaque or do anything in relation to it. I don't even know if it got mentioned when Sorensen came. I hope it did. But it's not much remembered, but I think a speech that resonates right to the current day and to the problems that we face. And he tried to take a turn and ended up dead, I believe, because of that turn that he was making, because it didn't represent the moneyed interests and the power interests that were around him and that he was fighting.